Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
This morning, we're going to be going into the study of 3 John. It's not a long book. It's what I would call a Brian book. You know, if I was writing a letter, this is probably the way that it would come out. As I've said before, you know, usually when I make a telephone call, it's just this is what it is, and have a good day, and I'm gone. And sometimes I send when people are texting me, you know, my favorite emoji is the thumbs up. I don't even, if they write the whole, sometimes these people will write 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs, include pictures and everything else. About the best they get is either a thumbs up or that's about it. I'm not a lot of, surprising. You know, I can, according to some, preach a 6-week lesson on Jesus wept, but when it comes to actually writing letters and phone calls and texting, I'm not, I'm really not geared toward that direction. And so this letter is short and sweet. It also shows us that in the early church, there were significant divisions, attitudes. Most of the time we think about the Judaizing teachers that came behind the Apostle Paul and others, saying that unless you're circumcised and keep the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. And a great deal of the writings are around that type of teaching. Others were teaching, that it was okay, or at least embracing the fact that it was okay to go back and to some of those sinful acts, that there wasn't anything wrong with it. As even today, people say, well, I don't see anything wrong with it. So we see a portion of the New Testament addresses the issue of sin, and that as a Christian, we have been purged from those sins and not to return. But 3 John is a very interesting letter. It is very personal in the sense that here he is specifically addressing an individual, and he's talking to this individual about the attitudes of a couple other individuals. Sometimes in the church, people say, well, we shouldn't name names. We shouldn't name names, and we shouldn't call out certain congregations for some of the things that they have and are involved in. Well, apparently John didn't get that memo, because while 2 John leaves us kind of questioning who the elect lady is and her elect sister, and whether we're talking about an individual or congregation, John gets right to the heart of the matter in this letter. And, most of the time, John kind of just speaks of himself, as John. He doesn't really push a lot of issues, even in his in the book of John. He doesn't really spend a lot of time identifying even himself. But when he opens this, he refers here to the elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. And so much like Philemon, this is a letter addressed to a specific individual. Of course, Paul wrote letters, we know, to Timothy and Titus, Philemon, and he also wrote them to specific churches. But here John speaks to someone who he is well known to and whom John knows himself very well. But he refers to himself here as the elder. Now, of course, the phraseology, the elder, can just speak to John's age, and that one who is older is writing to someone who is younger. And it also has and carries with it some of the official capacity. We know that Peter and James and some of those were elders in the church, as well as apostles in the church, as well as evangelists in the church. And so it's quite possible that John served in the capacity officially as an elder, and he speaks here not specifically as being an elder in the church per se, where Gaius was, but he at least brings out 2 points. There is the concept, the idea of the elder, who is the leader or the overseer of the church, as well as just his age. I've been around a few times. I've looped the subjects many times. And so, in life, we get experience, and experience teaches us many great lessons, both by the good things that we accomplish as well as our mistakes and shortcomings. If we're smart people at all, we learn from our experiences, and therefore, as we get older, we don't get to the age that we're at because we're stupid. We look both ways before we cross the street. We know which end of the gun is the business. Because you're smart, you've managed to learn a few things. As a kid, I never was tempted to stick a paper clip in an electrical outlet because, I heard, on the TV, the promo, about what it did. So I wasn't stupid enough to open up a paper clip just to see if they were right. So again, because of age itself, and having seen the experiences that have taken place in the church, having been with Jesus when he walked on earth, having been with the church for decades, and now reaching, the place where he would be considered an elder statesman, if nothing else, in the body of Christ. And so there is the issue of respect. I know that's not something that we see a lot of today. But when I was growing up, the younger people respected the older people. We didn't call them the elder people, we called them the older people. And I'm sure many of you have been told, y'all get out and play. The grown-ups are talking. There was a place and a time, and this wasn't it. Grown-ups are talking, you go play. That's not for you. And so, when someone, came in, if you were sitting on the couch and there was no other room, you got up, because before they even asked you, you understood that the older person got the seat even if you were there first. And if you didn't catch on to that, by the time they pinched you in the back of the neck and picked you up off there, you learned rather quickly. So if you didn't understand that to start with, you probably learned it along the way. And so, there was a sense of respect and honor for elders. Respect your elders. They have worked, they have labored, they have served. They put your food on the table, they give you the house that you're living in, the clothes that you're wearing. There's that kind of concept in the family that, you should respect your elders for what they've done, what your grandparents have done, what your parents have done. And so that concept should spill over into the church, not, again, just because you're old. Sometimes people who aren't really smart and don't always make the best decisions, they live to be old too. So you have to take into consideration all things. But John is a person that, due to his close relationship with Jesus, having been there on the day of Pentecost, having seen the growth of the church in the city of Jerusalem, having witnessed it go out into Judea, Samaria, Galilee, to the uttermost parts of the earth. Even John, in his writing the book of Revelation, speaks and writes to the 7 specific churches in Asia. John had again, accomplished quite a bit in his lifetime. He had seen a lot, experienced a lot. So you would think if John had something to say to you that you would take some time to listen. I mean, this man has something that he would like to say. But again, pride sometimes gets in the way. There are some who believe that no matter what the circumstances or situation, their opinion trumps everybody else's because they're the smartest one in the room. And that's who we run into here in the book of John 3. Gaius is not that person. Gaius is a beloved person whom John knows. And to, again, identify him in his life, John says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospers," or prospereth. That's a pretty good thing. I don't know whether Gaius had any particular problems going on, but John wished him that his physical body was as good as his spiritual body, that his relationship with the physical world was as good as his relationship with God. Now, this kind of becomes a test too. If John wished that upon us, would we get better or worse? It's one of those things where maybe for some people you don't wish that they prosper physically as they do spiritually. If that case, they would probably be eaten of worms and crumble into dust. And so this is an individual whom John knows, whom he is comfortable writing to. He's comfortable calling him by name. And he's also comfortable about identifying others who are causing issues and problems. And so he has a general introduction. We get to know a little bit about him, a faithful member in the body of Christ. He says, "For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. Now, this is kind of, again, all leading up, but to a circumstance or situation that he's going to identify. But, sometimes you hear bad news. You get bad news about a congregation or whatever, and you automatically wonder, well, what about Gaius? You get news that sometimes is troubling or would break your heart. And then, there's some people that that goes to that congregation. And so you automatically think, well, what about Gaius? Or whoever that person is. I mean, is he still there? Is he still worshiping there? With this bad news that you've brought me, what about Gaius? And John says that I rejoiced greatly, even after receiving some bad news. He says, I rejoiced to learn that you were still walking in the truth, that you were still taking a stand for what is right. And so 3 John tells us that, again, just because a congregation or just because someone who is the proclaimed leader or the smartest one in the room, or just because they lay siege to a congregation, does not necessarily mean that everybody that goes there has bitten the poison apple. They haven't all went along with the corporate line that's being portrayed. And so, it's as if as we go down through this letter, when his messenger comes back, he comes back with bad news. And we're going to get to the bad news a little bit later. But there's that question, what about Gaius? Gaius is someone who I know. He's well beloved. And again, John is a disciple of love. We call him that. He writes about love. And so he had a good brotherly relationship. So what about Gaius? So when the brethren came back and gave me their report, I rejoiced greatly when they came and testified of the truth that's in thee. Now, again, the question ultimately comes up with, how long will Gaius stay there? If someone else has taken the church hostage, and I don't know really of a better term for that, has taken the church hostage, there are those who still hold to the truth and they attempt to restore the problem that's there. And so they don't just get up and leave. That's an option. But, it's sad that the good people have to leave the congregation because the bad people take it hostage. That those who change the truth grab hold of the congregation, and those elderly people who can't go anywhere else, what are they going to do? This is a situation that we find many times. We get bad news about a congregation, a preacher, some elders have came in, whatever it is. And they're turning the congregation upside down. There's some people who can't drive very far. They can't go anywhere else. And so many of them are left to walk in truth and in faithfulness. We're in 1 John 3, Dave. Or we're in John 3. 3 John. Too many Johns. John 3. 3 John. But again, the idea was that there is still someone there. And so It says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. You know, if you were like John and you have been around to so many congregations, probably started some congregations, and most certainly were instrumental in the converting of many sinners to saints, and therefore taking the oversight and educating and teaching, they were like his children. And so these congregations, these individuals that he knew and he'd been around for a while, they're like his children. And he speaks of that in 1 John, the 2nd chapter there. He talks about my little children. And he's talking about the members of the body of Christ. Here John, an apostle, and he was there on the day of Pentecost. He was there at the start. I mean, it's like they're all his children, right? I mean, they were all there on the day of Pentecost, the church that started there in Jerusalem as the gospel message went out. I mean, it was easy for John to say, you're all my children in one sense or the other, because, we were at the beginning. We were there. And so, again, to hear that these walk according to truth, both individually and again that all of them, congregations. It's sad sometimes, again, congregation that you worked with, that someone again comes along, turns it upside down. Yes.
John, he's seen a great transformation take place. He's seen it go from a time where there was no forgiveness of sin into a time where just the Jews was able to go and worship God. And he's seen it change to where there was forgiveness of sin, not only for the Jews, but for everybody.
For the Gentiles, all the nations.
This had to be, really, if you love God and you love these people, this was something really to see. And, to recognize, no longer is it the Jews, but it's everybody.
And again, it's something that maybe as we see, the disciples really at the beginning, I don't think they really understood that the nations and the Gentiles, and when Jesus said go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, I think they heard go into all the world and preach to the Jewish people in every synagogue. They kind of interpret, because they still stayed there. And even after the persecution of Saul, they went into every city, but they still weren't really preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. And you're right, to see in one lifetime. I mean, this is the amazing thing. In one lifetime, we've seen moving from the law of Moses to the preaching of John, to the coming of Jesus, the establishment of the church, and it literally going out into the world, to the nations. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. Now here's a guy who is filled with care and concern for all. One of the things that Peter said when he was speaking to the household of Cornelius is, I perceive, he had, with his visions and all the things that had happened with Peter, he says, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. And so one of the things that John speaks about Gaius is, if Gaius has known you for a long time, he's probably your best friend. He's a person who would always be there if you needed him. And also, if you're a person who came into the congregation for the first time and you were a stranger and nobody there knew you, you left with one friend, and that was Gaius, because he knew you. And I can just imagine that, there's Gaius watching the door. As the people come in, he's again friendly toward all, the brotherhood. And the stranger that comes in is especially interesting to Gaius because he may not be a Christian. Where did you come from? What about your family? I mean, he was just the guy that I feel would be greatly concerned about what was going to happen now that you've been to the congregation. And so he had the same attitude toward the ones that were there as he did to a stranger. And so we can understand why John, he's living. I mean, this guy is living what John wrote about in 1 John. And we've studied about the love of brotherhood. And, if we can't love our brother who we've seen, how can we love God who we've not seen? And he goes into all of that. And so Gaius is the poster child for 1 John. I mean, that's kind of the way I see it. The things that John taught about love and fellowship and caring and compassion, Gaius, he lives that. It's not just a concept to Gaius, but it's a life goal to live that. To live that before every single person. And so he says about the way he does to brethren and to strangers, he says, which have bore witness of thy charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. There are witnesses. Again, there are these individuals who have went to where Gaius and his congregation is, and they have returned to John with news. John wrote a letter to this congregation, and there were those who delivered it or attempted to deliver it, saw and experienced the situation at the congregation, and they came back to John bringing news about the situation and the circumstance. And so not only did he hear that Gaius was doing well, but these individuals who John sent, no doubt, Gaius helped them. While they were there, he extended hospitality to them. And when it was time for them to go back to John, he sent them on the way. And so, again, his charity, his love, his concern, and, in doing that, again, thou shalt do well, because that for this man's sake they went forth because that for his, that's Christ's name's sake, they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. And talking about those who, again, were preaching and teaching the gospel, carrying the messages, and they weren't doing it for pay. They weren't doing it for what they could get from the congregations. The messengers, those who were going forth, they did so at the, again, mercy and charity and hospitality of the brethren that they were in contact with.
Also the church being new, the Jews, they had to change their lifestyle, the Christian Jews. I mean, it was a big change. I mean, going from the time before that here you was God's only people, you felt, and then to a time to where that everybody was called in. And so they had to set forth an example showing that they had changed. You know, that we're no longer up above the Gentiles, but we're on equal terms with you. And we're not here, you know, for gain, you know, make a profit of it, but we're here, you know, to spread the gospel, Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And to be, you know, that example with it, you know, showing, you know, what there was after, that there was after the soul and love.
And again, the point that John's making here is, we therefore ought to receive such that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. You know, again, we give and support and help those who are with us so that we are fellow helpers in the spreading of the truth. Again, this congregation, others are helping us with what we're doing in India. Again, opinions vary, but the truth of the matter is we're going to graduate about 30 preachers within the next 6 months. And those preachers are going to be preaching to people who are lost, going out into the communities. And it's the assistance that we have got from this congregation, other congregations, that's made that possible. And therefore, we are fellow helpers with the truth. Again, we share the videos, the training, we share that, and people watch that and see that, and you get credit for that. You know, the idea of fellow helper, the word fellow there comes from the same idea of fellowship. But in this case, it's not just a fellowship, but you're a fellow helper. And that is that you are not just communing with each other. Hey, how you doing? You know, good to see you. You know, glad you're here today. You know, how's the kids? How's the family? You know, hug, hug, kiss, kiss. I mean, that's fellowship. But being a fellow helper, that's a whole different thing. What do you need? I'm glad to see what you're doing. What do you need that I can help you? How can I join you in helping you do what you need to do? And that's what John's saying. You who help become fellow helpers. It's as if you're rolling up your sleeves. It's if you're standing there with them when they accomplish the things that they do. You know, that's your accomplishment too, because you're a fellow helper. They couldn't do it if you didn't help them. They'd be stuck, limited, but now they have the ability, whether it's to buy gasoline, get tracts, distribute Bibles. They can now do that. They couldn't do that before. They have a way of doing that. So we become fellow helpers with them. And so that's what happened many times with the Apostle Paul, congregations, others. He speaks about the church there in Philippians, you know, that they in time past had assisted him, had given him things, and they were his fellow helpers in the gospel. He lists individuals by name in Romans and others who worked with him. You know, we give Paul all the glory, but if you read the ending of many and all of Paul's writings, you'll find he had a lot of fellow helpers, people who were there doing many different things, making it all possible. And so this is how, you know, again, the church works. There is the fellowship, the love, the care, both the brotherhood, the strangers, wanting to help and to assist. And so we have all of that. So he says that to get down to verse 9. He said, I wrote to the church. Now he's writing to Gaius, and he identifies the letter to Gaius. See, there has been a letter sent and messengers were sent to deliver it, and they have came back to John with a report, and John is now writing a specific letter to Gaius. But John says, I wrote to the church first. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. We got a letter here, greetings, brethren. We have a letter here from John with some information, We don't want it.
Yeah, who's John be trying to run us? Tell us what.
Yeah, who's John be telling us what to do? What, you tell us today that we ought to be following the New Testament. That's none of your business, the way we conduct things here. So again, they tried to deliver the letter. I wrote a letter to the church. And again, those days, where was the church? Where was the church?
It was in the hearts of the people.
It was in the heart, but where did the church meet? In homes. And whose home you suppose probably the church was meeting? Diotrephes, because knocked on his door, because that's where the church meets. We don't want it. Take it back. This is he wouldn't receive us.
Yeah, possibly too. He thought, since it's my home, I'm going to run up away without see fit.
Your guest, the church is a guest in my house. It's my house. And again, I'm graciously extending all this to you. And so it's my way or the highway. And for you two, or however many there was, for you two, it's the highway. He wouldn't receive us. He wouldn't even let them in. That's the point. There were probably a couple messengers, maybe one, but generally they went with at least two probably because of safety and other concerns. And so the chances are they knocked on Diotrephes' door. And now, if they knocked on Gaius's door, he'd have threw the door open and say, come on in. Glad to see you. You want something to drink? Let me get some water so we can get your feet washed. Let me give you some ointment because you've been traveling. Let's do that. I wrote to the church, and Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence, would not receive us. He extended no hospitality. And so in receiving the messenger or messengers of John, since they were his fellow helpers, it was like receiving John. And to reject them or not receive them, not to extend to them hospitality, it's like rejecting and slamming the door in John's face. Now, apparently, some of those, Diotrephes says no. As they started maybe asking around, are there other Christians here, whatever, and it seems that along the way, however it worked out, they came into contact with Gaius, and Gaius received them, and he helped them and would send them on their way back. And so, we know this situation and circumstance. again, not wanting to receive us. Then in verse 10 it says, wherefore, if I come. That's a conditional statement, if I come. Well, would you? And Diotrephes has basically slammed the door in the face of John's representatives. So, would you come? I mean, how do you feel about that? And Jesus had told them when he sent them out, if you go into a city and there they will not receive you, knock the dust off your feet when you leave. Don't even take the dust from that city. Leave it all behind. Don't let it get you down and wear you out and depress you when it comes to the next city. And so here he says, when I come, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words. Not only did he not receive the messengers from John, but he spoke evil of those messengers so that anybody else would probably not receive them either. Isn't that the way it is?
Reminds me where it was in David Christ, how the Jews followed after Paul, is they would go to where he was preaching at, so they could stir up trouble and speak against everything that Paul taught. So they didn't want to see the word themselves. They didn't want others to hear it either.
And we see that today in many places, and I know our time's up, but we see it where people say things like, well, Paul hated women. When the subject matter comes up about women preachers, they say things like, well, Paul hated women. Again, that's speaking evil of Paul and his intentions and all of that. And again, many times they'll speak evil of the scriptures. I know what it says, but I think this is as good as that. And so, again, not only, it's one thing, to either literally or figuratively slam the door in the face, but then, again, it's almost like he got up in the congregation. I don't know all the circumstances. We have to fill in some blanks, but it would seem to me that if you were looking to deliver a letter to a congregation and to a church, the best time to be there would be when the church is assembled. Now, I don't know if this is the case or not, but these messengers came and he refused them. And then it said that he, again, spoke bad things, spoke against them to the church. So rather than receiving the letter of John and sharing the letter of John, the letter of Diotrephes got presented. The message of Diotrephes got presented, and that was a message of hate and ill will, both toward the messengers as well as the one who wrote the message, which was John, which again was backed up by, again, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit.